Well, I hate to break up good fellowship, but it is time for us to begin this evening. So if you would, find a place to sit down and open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 8, where we are continuing to study the Gospel of Mark, the denying self and following Jesus, and kind of the theme of this book. And we're really about to get into, I've been telling you all the time we've been studying Mark, that chapter 8 is the pivotal point of this book. And so here we are in chapter 8, almost at that pivotal point. But we're going to study tonight some things that lead up to that. Of course, we've talked about over and over the cyclical nature, especially of this first half of the book, where you've got these miracle sections, and then you'll have an opposition section, and then you'll have a teaching section, and then another miracle section, and it just continues to flip-flop around that way. So you've got the three miracles that we've just got through looking at that were put together, the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, the healing the deaf and mute man, the feeding of the 4,000. And then that brings us tonight to this next section where Jesus is going to face some opposition, which is typically what happens after these miracles take place, that the Pharisees are going to come and oppose him, and then we're going to hopefully have enough time to look at both the teaching that Jesus gives as well as this next miracle that will be important as we move forward. So just to back up a verse and remind you of what happened after the feeding of the 4,000, it says, "And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha." And a couple of things to pay attention here. I've tried to make the point as we've gone through this that there's really four, I guess, really major groups of people that Mark is pointing out that are distinct. You've got the crowds, and we've talked about how the crowds and the people following along are coming to where Jesus was for various reasons. That keeps growing. Some are coming just because they want to see the spectacle, and some are coming because they want to eat, and some are coming because they need to be healed or whatever it might be. And then you've got a group that is called the disciples or the followers of Jesus. And that typically we think of the disciples and we think of the 12, but the 12 is a third group. It seems like with Mark makes a distinction between the 12 disciples that Jesus called to be that inner circle and a larger group of followers that went wherever Jesus went, that were wanting to learn, that were asking the questions, wanting to understand more and that type of thing. So it seems like it's more than just the 12 and Jesus, but they get into the boat and they go to Dalmanutha. Now, where is Dalmanutha at? We don't know. There's a lot of speculation, and I'll tell you, I'll emphasize it's speculation, that the area is what we would refer to as Magdala. And the reason why is because a word that sounds kind of like Magdala is what, in Matthew's account, he says is where they went. So they're speculating that that word that sounds like Magdala is Magdala, but we don't know that, So the one thing I think we can be sure of is the fact, and I got a little zoom in here so you can see where Magdala is over on the western side, which is the Jewish side. I think we can be fairly confident that it's on the Jewish side that Jesus goes to for two reasons. Number one, because immediately what's going to happen is the religious leaders, the Pharisees, are going to come to Jesus. That happens on the Jewish side. And the second reason is because after we get done with this, he's going to, the text will say he's going to go across the sea to Bethsaida. Well, you can see over in the middle of the hook of the question mark, Bethsaida is over on the other side, on the eastern side, in Gentile territory. So whether exactly it was where Magdala is or somewhere in that general area, it must have been on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee anyway. So this first couple of verses here that we're going to look at tonight is this opposition section of the Pharisees coming to seek a sign again, they're trying to challenge Jesus or test Jesus and see if they can figure out a way to entrap him and to ruin his reputation. Tucker, if you would, I forgot to turn that projector on. If you would, I'm sorry, but it keep me from having to turn around so much if I do. So, verses 11 and 12, the Pharisees came and began to argue, and you'll notice on the screen it's in orange. This is the same color that we're using for all of our sight words. We talked about the introduction, and there's still some of that introductory material out there on the little cabinet out yonder, but of the key words, this is the prevalent thought that you see repeated. There's three different sight words in the Greek used here, but throughout this book it's about sight, and this word that's translated argue is one of those sight words. They're not seeing it the same way as Jesus. They came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven. That's what they're wanting, is him to prove that he is who he says he is. Now, in the Gospel of John, John uses this word sign for a particular purpose. Mark doesn't use it in that way, but there's typically a different word that Mark uses for miracles that has to do with power. What they're wanting is not really so much just a miracle. They're wanting something really big. Something that's not just an average, ordinary kind of miracle, I guess you could say, if there's anything average, ordinary about miracles. They're wanting something really big to show that he is the one, that we should give any legitimacy to who you claim that you are. And you can see that they don't have the best of intentions in what they're doing, because Mark tells us that they're here to test him. They're wanting to ruin his reputation or destroy him, we talked about earlier. But they want a big something. They want a miracle. Show us some way that you're from God. Well, already in the Gospel of Mark, we've had 17 miracles. How many miracles do you need? If you were, there's been lots of COVID taking out NFL players right now. If they heard about Danny Cash's prowess on the spike ball field, and they said, we're going to sign Danny to be the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, and he has a game where he throws 4 touchdowns and 350 yards and no interceptions, we might say that was what? Luck, right? That was luck, right? Then he comes out week 2 and he throws for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns and no interceptions. We might say, well, he's got some pretty good teammates around. If he goes 17 games where he's the leading passer in the NFL, then suddenly we're all going to want to be Danny's friends, because they're going to sign him to a big contract at that point, right? Jesus hadn't done something big once. He's done it 17 times. And he's really done more than that. You remember at the end of John's gospel, he says many more things that Jesus did, that if you try to write everything down, that there wouldn't be enough room in the world to hold all the books that would contain all he did. This is just what Mark has recorded. And it's not to bring into account the fact of how he taught and the way he taught, which was another indication that, you remember at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the people were amazed that he taught as one who had authority. He taught differently than everybody else. So there's all of this, but we want one more sign. We want one more proof that you are who you claim you are. And then it's an interesting line here at the beginning of verse 12. It says, and he, that's Jesus, sighed deeply in his spirit. You remember back when a few weeks ago we studied the mute and deaf man, and how that when Jesus healed him, he groaned toward heaven, and we talked about that's kind of an anguish kind of sound that he made, that it was indicative of the compassion that he was showing to this man. Well, it's the same idea that's here. These are people that aren't getting who Jesus is, and they're trying everything they can to tear him down and to ruin his reputation, but Jesus still loves and cares for these people. And it hurts him that they're not getting it, which is a great lesson for us. When people oppose us, do we want to shut them down and shut them up and show them who really knows what, or do we continue to show compassion to them because it hurts us that they're not getting it. Well, that's what Jesus did. He sighed deeply in his spirit, and then he says, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Why are you looking for a sign? I've already given you 17 at least. Why do you need another one? This continuing to ask for one more or something else, but I'm not going to give you anything else. Now, here's the question. When Jesus says, no sign will be given to this generation, does Jesus mean I'm not going to give you any more signs? Because he has given signs. Is this the last sign he's going to perform? It's not. He's going to perform some more. In fact, if you remember the screen I showed you, I gave you the answer. The third segment we're going to talk about tonight is another miracle. We're still to get to, at the end of the book, the greatest sign that Jesus is who he claimed he was, and that was what? His resurrection. He came out of the grave. Been people that's been raised from the dead, but what happened to all of them? They died again. And that was one of course, Peter's points on the Acts chapter 2 and Sermon on Pentecost. You know, you can go look at David's grave, and he's in the grave. You can go look at Jesus' grave. He didn't really have a grave. He just borrowed a grave because he only needed it for 3 days. See? So he's the only one that's ever done that. The point that he's making is that I'm going to show signs. I'm going to continue to show who I am, but it's going to be useless for this generation because you're not paying attention. You're not seeing what I'm doing. And that's really the idea that's most prevalent in what we're going to study tonight, verse 11 down to verse 26. If you've marked the key words in your text, then you'll notice if you mark the same color. In fact, I took a picture, if I can find it right quick. I took a picture this afternoon to show. This is, I don't know how well you can see that, but this is a text from my Bible. That page from 11 down to, actually that goes down to verse 33 with this last one here. But every word that I circled in the picture in red is a sight word. Well, guess what he's talking about here? If in 15 verses, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times he's talking about sight, guess what he's talking about here? Sight, that's right. Sometimes my questions are harder than the answers, I think, but that's what spiritual blindness is the problem here. It's not the fact that Jesus can't do or won't do things for them to prove who he is. It's the fact that no matter what I do, it's not going to be enough. Because you're unwilling. If you're on Facebook and you saw the little photo invitation that I put on there today inviting people to come to Bible study tonight, the title said spiritual blindness, and the picture was a man doing this. He had his hands over his eyes. Well, why is he blind? Because he put his hands over his eyes. He didn't want to see what was going on. That's the problem with these people, is that they don't want to see what's going on. In John chapter, John chapter 8, 7, it's not 7. Maybe it's 5. I don't know. In John, when Jesus heals the blind man, you go through that section, and it's amazing to see how everybody that can see is blind to who Jesus is, and the one guy who's blind is the only one who sees who Jesus is. It's amazing. And that's what's going on here. You've got all these people that can see, but they won't see what's going on. And that's the problem with what's this generation. Now, we think of the Pharisees as the bad guys, and we think of them as the guys that are the problem or whatever, and they were a problem. But again, remember, Jesus wants them to understand. And not all of the Pharisees didn't get it. If you recall, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. And he maybe wasn't as vocal as he should have been, but he was one who recognized who Jesus was. So then after this opposition section, verses 13 through 21, is a teaching section. Jesus warns of the leavening of the Pharisees. The 12 are going to fail to see who Jesus is now. It says that he left them, so Jesus left these Pharisees, these religious leaders, on the western side, on the Jewish side. He got into the boat again and he went to the other side. And, it's maybe one of the reasons why Jesus spent so much time around water was so that he could get away from people quicker than he might normally have been able to. But he goes to the other side, and we're now on, again, Gentile side. Verse 14 says that they had forgotten, that they is the 12, the followers, the disciples. They had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. Well, if you write in your Bible, circle one loaf and draw a line down to verse 16 where it says, no bread. They're eventually going to say, hey, we didn't bring any bread. Is that true? No, they had a loaf of bread, okay? Sometimes, and you'll notice this as we go through this, sometimes when we look at our situations, when we leave the Lord out of the equation, we begin to exaggerate how bad things are and how desperate our situation is to the point we make it worse than it really is, and that's what they've done. Now, ultimately what's going to happen here is they're going to be concerned that they don't have enough bread. Let's say, I don't know how many people's in this boat. Most of the boats at that time that they had here on the Sea of Galilee, that they found at least, would hold somewhere between maybe 12 to 20 people at the most. Let's say we're at max capacity and then some. Let's say there's 24 people. Would a loaf of bread feed 24 people? Would it? It'd feed them a little. Okay? How many loaves did it take for Jesus to feed 5,000? See what we just did there? What did we leave out of that equation? And that's what they did. I didn't know y'all were going to do that, but it served as a good illustration. With Jesus, is one loaf enough? Would that fill them? Yeah. And that's what he's going to get to eventually. So the problem that we're going to see in this section is it's one thing for the Pharisees who've kind of made up their minds and they're coming back and forth to seeing Jesus to have spiritual blindness. But what you see in this section is these are followers of Jesus who, if anybody asked, who are you? They would say, I'm a disciple of Jesus. I am a follower of Jesus. I left my fishing business that my family owned. I left my tax collection business that made me very wealthy. I left everything behind because I am now a professional follower of Jesus. And the professional followers of Jesus don't see who Jesus is. They have spiritual blindness. And so in verse 15 it says that he cautioned them, saying, and here's another couple of our words here. He cautions them and says, watch out. That's one of those sight words. Beware, that's another one of those sight words, of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, what does leaven do? It makes bread rise, right? It is the power and the influencer that makes your biscuits from being that to that, or your loaf of bread from being a tortilla to a loaf of bread, right? That's the point that he's talking about here. Beware of the power and the influence of the Pharisees, and beware of the power and the influence of Herod. And it's not a good thing. In fact, almost every time in the New Testament that leaven is mentioned, it's in a negative connotation. It's used as a negative illustration or example. Jesus is saying you're allowing the influence of the Pharisees and of Herod control the way you think. This is the kingdom of man versus the kingdom of God. It is the power of man versus the power of God. Are you going to let God rule and reign in your life? Are you going to see who He is? Are you going to put your hands over your eyes and say, I'm more comfortable with that? So beware of that, he says. And then Jesus is giving them this great theological statement. this is one of these foundational things, followers, that you need to get. You need to focus on me rather than be influenced by men. And they hear leaven, and what's the first thing they think of? We didn't bring enough groceries. Now, if I was traveling with my 3 boys, teenage boys, and I said something about, you got any bread? And they said, oh no, we're going to go hungry. That would be understandable with teenage boys, wouldn't it? But these guys, that shouldn't be their first thought. Verse 16, though, says, and they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. But again, we drew our line from verse 16 up to verse 14. What did he say in verse 14? They had 1 loaf. Now, is 1 loaf of Jesus enough? It should be. It is. But they don't see that. In fact, they see instead of seeing 1 loaf and saying, well, hey, that's probably not enough to feed all of us, but with Jesus, that's more than enough. They look at it and they say, we don't have anything. They do have something, but in their exaggerated way of thinking, it's like we don't have anything because it's not enough in our eyes to do any good. So they hear leaven and they think we don't have any bread. We don't have enough bread. But 1 loaf with Jesus was more than enough. So verse 17, Jesus, aware of this, I love how many times in the New Testament, in the gospel accounts, I love how many times that the disciples are discussing something and they think they're discussing it among themselves, and Jesus knows what they're talking about. It's kind of like as parents, whenever you say, what were you just saying? And you already know, so just go ahead and tell me. So Jesus asks them, what he's going to do really is ask a series of questions. The first question that he asks is, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? There's 2 reasons why you should not be discussing the fact that you have no bread. The first one is, you have bread. So there's a faith problem going on. The second reason that you should not be discussing the fact that you have no bread is you're forgetting who's in the boat with you and the 1 loaf of bread. And if anybody ought to get it, it ought to be you, followers of Jesus, shouldn't it? So, next question. Do you not perceive or understand? And there's 2 different words that's used here. The first word, perceive, is a word that actually means to understand something. It's not a side word, it's a comprehension word. Then the second word that he uses here is this word, understand, that we spent a lot of time back when we were in chapter 7 talking about this word. And we mentioned that it's used in chapter 4 and chapter 6 and chapter 7 and chapter 8. This is a word that means to gain insight. It means to grasp something that you haven't known or been taught before, something new. Are you willing to be taught something new, something outside of your comfort zone, something outside of what you had thought before, something maybe that you would say, whoa, when you heard it? Are you able to be taught that, to see the evidence and then latch on to it? Are you able to have your mind changed when you're presented the facts? Disciples, don't you comprehend what's going on? Can't you open up your mind and be taught something that's different than what you thought before? Aren't you able to do that? Or, next question that he asks them, are your hearts hardened? Are your hearts hardened? See, if we're not the kinds of students that are able to be taught, that are willing to listen, that are willing to have our minds changed about something and maybe that we're wrong, what it means is we have hard hearts. Well, when we think about that, that brings us back. I keep pointing all the way back to when Jesus taught the parable of the sower and the seeds, and some of that soil was hard soil, right? and the roots couldn't penetrate, and it couldn't grow. And that's what's happening, is all of this is taking place around you. There's seeds being thrown on you nonstop, and your hearts are so hardened because you're not willing to open your mind and listen and understand and see that it can't take root and grow. And if it can't take and root and grow, remember the other teaching Jesus taught, it's never going to grow and become the biggest tree in your garden. Never going to happen. And we also talked about a couple weeks ago, what comes out of the mouth is what shows what kind of heart you have. Well, what's come out of their mouth? We have no bread. What are we going to do? Jesus is going to starve us to death, I reckon. What kind of hearts are they showing that they have? And these are the followers of Jesus. Now, you'll notice here, verse 17, he says, do you not perceive? If you circle that and draw a line down to verse 27 where he says, yet again, both of those yets indicate that the reason why they haven't got it yet isn't because they can't get it. They just won't get it. You could, you just haven't. And so in verse 18, he says, having eyes you do not see, here's another sight word, and having ears you do not hear, and do you not remember? Now he quotes from Ezekiel, which is also quoted by Isaiah, which is quoted a bunch of times by Jesus in the gospel accounts. You've got eyes, but you don't see. You've got ears, but you don't hear. Yes, you can see physically stuff that goes on in front of you. You can hear. Your ears are taking in sound waves and processing it to your brain, but you're not really seeing or hearing anything that's happened in front of you. And that's a problem. Now, he's going to walk them back through this and show them how they should have put it all together. Verse 19, the first of the examples that he gives is, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did we take up? Another question Jesus asks. How many baskets did we pick up whenever we fed the 5,000? Y'all remember? There were 12, and they say 12. Is that the right answer? That's ding, ding, ding in the game show. Here it goes. You got first round right. They remember the event, don't they? And how could they not? You remember, they were the ones that they're going to Jesus and they're getting some bread and some fish and they're passing it out to he had them sit down in groups of 50 and 100 and they give it out and, well, I guess that's it. Oh, well, Jesus has got some more. They go get some more and they come back to another group and they're the ones passing all this out. And then they're the ones that picked up 12 baskets full of leftovers. Well, that's way more than we started off. How could they not remember that event? They remember the event. So Jesus asked them yet another question. He says, and the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? We had 7 loaves of bread. There were 4,000 men. When we got done feeding them all, and again, they're the ones, just like in the first time, they're the ones carrying the food back and forth from Jesus to everybody else. How many baskets did they pick up that time of leftovers? 7. And so notice what they answer. They said to him, 7. Ding, 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 we're going to the bonus round now. They remember the event. But the bonus round is, we're getting in a boat with 1 loaf. And what's their answer? Ain't got no bread. Ain't got enough groceries. Not enough snacks.
It's almost comical, isn't it?
It is. And of course, let me pause for just a minute. It's really easy for us to look at the disciples and say, those dumb disciples. I love studying the Old Testament because I can say, look at those dumb Israelites. They don't understand anything. You know, on this side of the cross, when I've got it all written down and I can study it, I can figure it all out. I don't know why they couldn't, you know. But there's some application for us about this and then. But it is comical to think about when we look at it this way. And if they wrote down the story of Corey, if there was the account of the life of Corey that everybody read and studied at Vacation Bible School, they'd probably say, how could that big dummy not understand all that? So verse 21, they don't figure out what the events mean. So he says to them, do you not yet, remember back in verse 17, he said, not yet, do you not yet understand? See, they remember the events, but they don't figure out what the events mean. They don't see the meaning behind the events. They see the thing, but they don't see what the thing is supposed to show them or teach them or instruct them. It just becomes about bread and eating. And so the problem with the disciples is the same problem with the Pharisees. It's not that they haven't seen enough signs to know who Jesus is. It's that they've seen them. They remember the events, especially the disciples. They were right there in the middle of all of it. But they're not putting it all together. It's not something that they're internalizing. So the last section we're going to talk about this evening is another one of these miracles. In verses 22 through 26, Jesus, when they get to Bethsaida, he's going to heal a blind man there. It says they came to Bethsaida. Now, again, I've got it written up there. I've got it written in my Bible. Don't lose the context of what's going on about sight and blindness. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. So as soon as, the way Mark tells it, as soon as Jesus gets off the boat, this is not an uncommon occurrence. We've seen it many times. They're immediately bringing somebody to Jesus. Why are they bringing somebody to Jesus? Because they've either seen it happen, that he's healed all manners of problems with people, or they've heard about it. And so they bring a blind man and begged him to touch him. Why did they beg him to touch him? We talked about a couple weeks ago, Jesus did a lot. He healed people. He did miracles in a lot of different ways, didn't he? Sometimes he just spoke it to the person. Sometimes he told them to do something. Sometimes he touched them. Sometimes he did it from a long distance away. We talked about with the deaf man who was mute, how that, he put spit in his ears and touched him on the tongue with his spit. We talked about how weird that was. Jesus could do it any way he wanted to. But they thought he needed to touch him. Now again, here we are over at Bethsaida, so we're in Gentile territory. It's amazing how many times you know when you read the Gospels how much more that the Gentiles put it together better than the Jews did. And I'm not sure why that is. You go through and you read every occurrence, Matthew through Acts, every occurrence that you read about a centurion, they're getting it more than the Jews do. Every time you read about a Samaritan, they're getting it more than the Jews do. So that's where he's at, and he's there with them bringing this blind man. So it says, verse 23, he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Now, the way that this is presented, it's very much parallel to the healing of the mute deaf man. Remember, Jesus took him away from everybody else. Why did he do that? Well, we don't know. Perhaps it was because he was trying to be compassionate and he didn't want to embarrass the guy. Maybe it was because at the end of both of them, he says, don't tell anybody about it. That messianic secret that we've talked about many times. But for whatever reason, he led him out of the village. And here we go with another, we wouldn't probably do it this way. When he had spit on his eyes, I can't see very well. If Danny walked in and said, I forgot my glasses and I can't read this, and I said, well, here, take your glasses off. He actually took his glasses off. He trusts me more than I thought he would. And I spit in his eyes, what would he do? Man, do you not know we have a pandemic going on? What do you mean spitting in my eye? But that's what Jesus does. And then he laid his hands on him, and then he asked him. But before we get to the question, he asked him, did Jesus have to spit in his eyes to heal him? Did Jesus have to lay his hands on him to heal him? No. But he did that. And maybe it was a way for him to understand what was going on and what he was doing. But then Jesus' question is, do you see anything? There's our sight words again. And in verse 24, this is the man that's talking here. He looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. In other words, I see some outlines of some shapes that are moving around, but I can't really tell. His his sight was blurry. It was cloudy. It was not focused. Okay? Now, here's the danger in reading commentaries. There's a lot of comment. In fact, I read several today just to see how many I could find, what all they said. It's amazing how many commentators write something like this. This is an instant where Jesus maybe misjudged how much power he needed to use to heal this man, and that's why he wasn't completely healed to begin with. Does that sound plausible? Where, it's kind of like Kirk is up to bat, and he wants to hit a home run, but he just doesn't swing hard enough because he's fooled by an off-speed pitch, and he pops it up to the second baseman. That's what Jesus did, is he popped it up to the second baseman, right? Does that sound reasonable? Remember, what comes out of the mouth shows the heart, maybe. Or, this was a really bad case of blindness. I don't know how blindness could be any worse. If you can't see, you can't see. But maybe this is a really bad case of blindness, and it was so bad it took Jesus twice to heal him. Well, how much worse could you be than dead? Jesus never tried to raise someone from the dead, and, well, they're a little groggy. Let me try it again, There's something else going on. And I'll tell you what I think's going on when we go a little bit further. But he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. And so then, verse 25, Jesus laid on his hands on his eyes again. Jesus does this to the man. And when he removes his hands, the guy opens his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And in my mind, this is one of those that The Chosen hasn't done yet, but if I was directing this episode, this is the way I'd do it. As soon as Jesus removes his hand and the guy says, I can see clearly, I see Jesus looking at the disciples and going, one loaf? You didn't see what was going on? Because I think the point that Jesus is trying to make here with the disciples is this guy at first didn't see clearly, but because he stayed with me, now he sees clearly. Right now, you're not seeing everything clearly, but if you'll stick with me, you'll understand. We sing in the song, we'll understand it better by and by. Well, that's what Jesus is saying. Stick with me, and you'll see clearly. You'll see, as Jared would say, more better later on. Verse 26, and he sent him to his home, saying, do not enter the village. This is, again, that messianic secret. So why did Jesus take 2 times to heal this guy? Well, I think he did it on purpose because he's trying to make the point that's been made throughout this entire section, that there are a number of people that are spiritually blind, that they see what Jesus is doing, but they're not putting everything together. You've got the disciples that still from this point forward are going to be talking about, who gets to have the prominent positions when Jesus takes over as king. They are going to literally, they do it a number of times, but they're literally going to sit in that upper room with Jesus at the Passover feast hours before he's arrested to be crucified. God the Son died for everyone's sins, and they're sitting at the supper table going, I think I'm the best disciple. No, I think I'm the best disciple. I think I am far exceeding all of you in my devotion to God. Which is kind of like me and Danny arguing about which of us is the best quarterback if Peyton Manning and Joe Montana was in the same room. They'd be saying, guys, look around, And Jesus does that. And you know how he does it? He takes off his outer coat, and he gets a bowl of water, and he bends down and washes their feet. They just don't get it. Now, here's the problem with that. We're going to, next week, I've been telling you, here's the pivotal point is in chapter 8. That's the pivotal point in the book of Mark. Peter's confession of Jesus being the Christ. And we think, well, they got it. They finally got it. And then 2 verses later, Peter's going to say, Lord, you're not going to go die. And Jesus is going to have to get on to him and say, get behind me, Satan. You're still not getting it. There's still some spiritual blindness because you've made up your mind what you want it to be, and you're not seeing what's being presented in front of you. Now, little application for us. Isn't it easy for us to do that same thing? How many times has something happened in our lives and we think it's doom and gloom and this is the end, and just at the right time we receive whatever blessing that we need? Maybe it's somebody or something or some more time or whatever it is, and we're thank God for that blessing, and then 2 months later it's the end of the world, and woe is me, what am I going to do? How often do we forget what Jesus has done for us and then try to figure things out on our own and not get it? And how many times do we have our minds made up of this is the way it ought to be, or this is the way that it is, or whatever, without ever looking to see what does Jesus say about it? See, we've got to be open-minded enough to be good students of God's Word, that I want to know what He says about it, not I want to prove what I think about it. And then we've got to have enough faith to realize that the same God that has provided and protected and done all for us is still here, and He's still active. And far too often we make our decisions and we make our plans without ever putting the Lord in the equation. Or we have the mentality of, well, if all else fails, we'll pray. Or the least I can do for you is pray for you. Now, the first thing we ought to do is pray. And the most we can do is pray and turn to God first. So, be reading the rest of chapter 8, and next week we are going to, again, get into a very important section for this book as we continue our study of the Gospel of Mark. Before we dismiss tonight, we have a few announcements. Before we get, have we cut off yet? We'll sound a Martin update for everyone that's online so you can get these announcements, but we'll